Hey, it's Art for my new microphone. MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface, has been around and published since 1983, although it was developed beforehand, and has since become a staple in music production and much more. Many music producers, myself included, utilize MIDI on a nearly daily basis and pretty much in every one of their sessions, especially when we work with virtual instruments and the like. And so in this video, I want to go over a few different techniques so that we can better utilize MIDI within our digital audio workstations. Now, because different DAWs utilize MIDI in different ways, I didn't want to make this a generalized video, and so we are going to be focusing specifically on Logic Pro, although a lot of what I have to share with you can apply to whatever digital audio workstation you are using. It's just that the specific techniques I'll be showing you are going to be in my DAW of choice, Logic Pro. And so without further ado, let's hop into Logic and go over a few different techniques for taking advantage of MIDI and using it to our fullest advantage in our digital audio workstations. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to talk about getting better MIDI out of our digital audio workstation. So I have a few different instruments loaded up right here, and the first tip I have for you is to invest in a proper MIDI controller. Personally, I have the Keylab 49 Essential from Arturia laid out in front of me. It's got 49 keys, so 4 octaves. And I also have a foot control down here, so I can sustain notes if I'd like to. Then unsustain. It also has the typical pitch and mod wheels here. It's got octaves, so I can shift the octave. So I'm hitting the same key there and shifting the octave. We've got chords and transitions right here. I've also got 8 pads right here, which is great for drumming, for example. It's got a DAW command center, which is great for controlling the transport, saving, punching in, and so on. I've also got a digital screen right here and controls if I'm using Arturia's instruments, which is a great feature for this particular MIDI controller. Then I've also got a bank of knobs and faders, again, which can be used to control Arturia instruments. If I open up the Analog Lab 5, for example, I can use these faders to control, for example, operator 1 level. I have hardware control over that, over the brightness, timbre, the chorus mix, for example, phaser mix, operator level 5. If that was connected to anything, perhaps the pitch envelope, and so on and so forth. So this is a pretty easy example of how we can utilize a MIDI controller to control not only the notes of a virtual instrument, but also the parameters within that virtual instrument. Now, I say that this is easy because the Analog Lab 5 from Arturia is automatically set up with the Keylab 49. However, we can also utilize this MIDI controller, the Keylab 49, to control other synths and other virtual instruments. So for example, if I look at Serum right here and open this up, I can actually MIDI learn different controls on this MIDI controller to different parameters within this synthesizer. So for example, if I was to right click on this sync window right here, I could go down here to MIDI learn, click on that, and then I can go to the cutoff pan 1 knob right here on the Arturia Keylab 49 and just move this a little. And now I have control over that sync window. You see it moving without me clicking the mouse. And I'm just turning this rotary knob, that first knob, on the Keylab 49. And so the mono synth from the Analog Labs right here is automatically set up with this controller. However, we can also utilize third-party software, third-party virtual instruments, and actually learn MIDI to control these virtual instruments with different hardware controls of our MIDI controller. And so if I was to hold down a note here, and I can actually learn this rotary knob to a multitude of different controls within Serum. For example, I can click on the cutoff right here, again, MIDI learn, and I will reach for that same knob right here. And now, so this knob controls the sync window as well as the cutoff of the filter. I could use one of these faders to control something else. For example, if I go to the detune and click again on MIDI learn, whatever I touch first on this controller will now control that. So I can use this fader now to control the detune. So I have a fader to control the detune and a knob to control the sync window and the cutoff of that filter. So if I was to play a note now, I can move the fader up, turn up the detune, turn down the detune, and if I was to touch the knob, I can open things up, fader, knob, fader. And we can do that for a lot of different MIDI instruments. For example, I could go down here to the Superior Drummer, and this probably isn't an instrument that I would actually utilize MIDI learning on. However, we could click on the snare, for example, and even MIDI learn the tuning. If I was to right-click MIDI learn, I could assign the tuning of this snare to, again, this first fader. And now as I move the fader and hit the snare, I can control that with the fader right here on my MIDI controller. Again, this isn't something that I would probably reach for in terms of MIDI learning and controlling parameters with a MIDI controller, but it is an option. And before moving on, I should mention that these controls on the MIDI controller may not be utilized on every single instrument we have. And so if I go down here to the 808, this sublab, for example, bring this up, and if I go down to the drive here as a random parameter and right click, there's no option here for me to actually link this to any MIDI controller. So I can go up here, I can go to the menu, open pack folder, rescan pack folder, get new sublab packs, interface, frequency, notes, ADSR, sampler, clear all playing notes. There's no option in this particular virtual instrument to actually link these controls. And so we're really only left with the note control, which is still perfectly fine. We can still go in and automate these parameters. We would just have to do so with a mouse, drawing things in or doing them in real time. But we won't be able to actually link these knobs and faders to any of the parameters in the sublab as an example. So I recently got the Keylab 49. I haven't fully set it up so that it runs perfectly with Logic, but it is, in my opinion, the best option I would buy for my situation here in my own studio. Perhaps I will do a full review of the Keylab 49 Essential once I get it all set up and running, but for now, it's a perfect MIDI controller for what I am using. You can get whatever MIDI keyboard suits your workflow. You can get one that just has keys, perhaps a pitch and mod wheel. You can get one that just has trigger pads. You can get one that has just knobs and faders to control a mixer. But if we do want to maximize the use of MIDI within our digital audio workstations, having a hardware controller like this one is a great step in the right direction. All right, tip number 2 is actually understanding our virtual instruments. So assuming if we are working with MIDI inside a DAW, we are working with virtual instruments. There are a bunch of different instruments that we can control using MIDI. They are typically all virtual. And I have here a few different examples of virtual instruments. These are a few of my go-tos that I like using in my music production to give you a general idea of how we can use MIDI with virtual instruments inside our digital audio workstations. Starting off, we have the stock E-piano from Logic. It's got a nice interface right here, and if we play around with it, we see that it is a polyphonic instrument first and foremost, so it can play multiple notes at once. And then we have a whole bunch of controls. We have a few different actual E-pianos to choose from. We can go metal piano if we wanted. So this one is pretty straightforward. We have our basic controls here, and then we can play it like a real piano, having this nice keyboard controller in front of us. Next up, we have a synthesizer from Xfer Records called Serum. I will leave links to all of these virtual instruments in the description box down below. And this is a polyphonic synth, so we can, again, play multiple notes at once. And we can get really in-depth with this plugin right here. We have multiple oscillators that we can utilize. For example, we can bring this one an octave up, turn it down a little bit, add another oscillator to it. We have our filter right here. We have envelope control. If we brought this envelope down, for example, we get more of a plucking sound. The two main keys I want to take away in this instrument is that one, it's a polyphonic synth. We have it set up that way. We could make it monophonic down here. And then change the legato if we wanted to. But it's polyphonic and we can play it with the keyboard right here. We can also play it with trigger pads if we wanted to. more of a chromatic style. But that is an example of a polyphonic synth. Let's turn that actually back to polyphonic. Now we can have a look at that mono synth from the Arturia Analog Lab 5. This is just a preset I have loaded up. So we can only play one note at a time with this one. And we have a bias toward the first note that was played. So if I play a higher note first, then I can go lower. Then if I played this note first, if I let go, it would go back to that note. And there's no re-triggering as I hit a new note in this particular patch, so we get a nice attack on the first note that is played. And then it just kind of goes on in the sustain as I played the other notes. That's me hitting the note right there. But we don't only have synths and things to play particularly with the keyboard. We also have drums. For example, I have the Superior Drummer 3 right here. This is my go-to virtual instrument for programming drums, and we can play this one with our keyboard, of course. Or we can play it with the pads, which I showed you earlier. Or of course, we could program that in our piano roll, which I will get to momentarily. We also have things like samplers. So I have the quick sampler, the stock one from Logic here. I have a snare loaded up in here. So this is what it sounds like. That's the actual snare itself, but because it's in a sampler, I can pitch it up and down. You could go one-shot mode, classic mode. So this one is polyphonic as well. I can play two notes at the same time if I'd like. So that is basic sampling right here. You can put any sample you'd like in here and then alter the pitch, alter the filter, the amp, among other things within this plugin, but we will just keep it simple for this video. Again, I'm trying to teach MIDI concepts rather than virtual instruments here. The last one we have here is an 808 from Sublab. This is a nice preset I brought up. This one is also monophonic, so we can only play one note at a time. That's what that sounds like. And in this case, I have the keyboard set an octave down so that I can hit that low D. I can go even lower. That's a little bit out of range. So in order to get the most out of our MIDI, we have to work within the range of our virtual instruments and to really understand how those instruments work inherently in order to drive them with appropriate MIDI information. The next tip I have, of course, is to understand your piano roll. And so if I go to the arrangement view and create a MIDI region, I can double click on that and that will open up the piano roll. And every DAW will have a slightly different piano roll right here. In most cases, we have the actual piano roll on the left-hand side in a vertical fashion. We have our C3 or middle C. We are back to that E piano. And we can opt to draw things in. In this case, I'm just going to hold down Command to trigger this second view, the pencil tool. And so I can draw things in here if I'd like. And then play this back. And I realize this is pretty basic, but this is how we would go about programming our virtual instruments to play within the arrangement view so that we can actually get some sound within our music production. So we could draw things in like that, and we could also record, for example. And I'm not a piano player by any stretch of the imagination, but I just want to show you that we can also record into the piano roll and have things show up like this. So that is inserting notes into the piano roll. We can then choose both of these and choose to join them if we'd like so. We can go in and alter these notes after the fact if we'd like. And then we have some options over here so we can quantize our notes. We also have strength and swing of the transposition. And so this has to do with the timing. You can see that we can set different timings right here, including straight notes, triplets, swings, quintuplets or septuplets, or even groups of 9 in the case of Logic Pro. And we have more triplets down here to choose from. And so let's say I wanted to record something else right here, and I will actually turn on the metronome and I'll play something out here. You see I accidentally went to the score there, so you can also get pretty interesting results when you don't have things quantized here. But if we go back to the piano roll, I've purposely or unpurposely messed up here at the end. And so what we can do is actually go back in, remove some of these, bring this one back up to match the other ones, and then we can actually select these and quantize them. Let's go to eighth notes in this case. And you see that it snapped everything to an eighth note right here. So if I undo this, this is what we had. So a little bit off in terms of timing, and then I can quantize these to eighth notes and have it sound like this. And there was a little bit of a swing there, so I can actually bring this to 50 so that there's no swing at all. And then if we zoom in, you can see that these notes are all starting at eighth notes from one another. So without swing. And as a little extra, I can actually go in here and change the timing to 5/4 because that's actually what I'm playing in, so that we can get a nice even loop here in terms of the bars I'm using. And so we have eighth notes right here. Again, we can adjust the swing. We can make those second eighth notes come a little earlier. We can also quantize the scale if we wanted to. And so we are playing in D Dorian in this case, which is an extension of C minor. It's the second mode of C minor. So if I went to Dorian right here and chose D, then we would have the exact same thing. But now if I wanted to change this to D Phrygian or a mode up, it would take whatever notes are in here and transpose them to what is closest. And so here we have a case where this 6 right here, this B, should either go up to a C or go down to an A flat to make it a minor 6, so that it would fit into Phrygian. And you see that it went up to that minor 7 right there. Let's undo that and keep it in D Dorian. What if I went to Aeolian? Would it also go up there? So this would be natural minor Aeolian right here, which also has that flat 6 versus the major 6. And it shoots it up there as well. So I think in Logic Pro, whenever you are scale quantizing, it will go to the note above where it's supposed to be. It will take any notes out of the scale and push them up to the next note rather than push them down. So let's undo that once again. So that's an important thing to note in your digital audio workstation, what may or may not happen when you do different quantization right here. We can also adjust the velocity, bring things up or bring things down. And this is just scratching the surface of what we can actually do inside of Logic Pro in this example with our MIDI in our piano roll. Now, before we move on to all of the functions that we have right here in terms of the MIDI transform, I do want to touch on another tip I have for you. And that is, especially if you're not a keyboardist like me, you can actually play things in slow motion and then speed them up with MIDI. And so that can simply be done within the transport of your digital audio workstation. You can actually bring this tempo up rather than 120. Let's go up to 170 and then play this back. So that is a lot faster than I would be comfortable playing. If I was to attempt playing this, it might go something like this. And so that is way off compared to what I did originally. It's a little bit too fast. And then if I was to push this even faster, I would really have trouble keeping up. And this is me actually trying, I guarantee you. So I'm a guitarist primarily, definitely not a keyboardist. You see that that is basically unsalvageable. But if I wanted to get to that, I have what I recorded at 120, half the tempo, and I can play this back at now 240 in the transport. So if you have something in your mind that you want to get out and you want to actually play it and get more of that human feel rather than drawing it in and having it be a little bit more robotic, then you can certainly do it this way by performing it at a slower tempo within your digital audio workstation and then speeding it up with the transport control up here. Now, if I did want to draw it in, if I did not have a controller or I really just wanted to draw it in, I could also do that. So let's create a MIDI region right here, zoom in. Again, I will use this draw tool and I will start with that D, and then at every eighth note, drag that up. And then I can just copy this because this is a repeating line. And then I'll copy that up as well. This is another huge time saver, copying and pasting. And now I have basically the same thing, but I just drew it in. And actually, these last ones are an octave down, so I'll bring those down as well. And now listening back. But it does sound a little bit more robotic. Everything is at the same exact velocity. Everything is perfectly quantized. All of the note lengths are the same. If we compare that to this section, which I actually played in. It does sound more human. It's a little sloppy toward the end, and we will have a look at that. But then if we compare that to this one, it's very much more robotic. And so that brings me to the next tip. If we are programming, we can actually go into, most digital audio workstations will have this, a function called humanize or something along those lines. And by clicking that, we can actually randomize the position of notes. So the starting position, we can randomize the velocity, and we can randomize the length right here. We can also opt to change the pitch, although I don't typically like doing that. And right down here, you see randomize plus or minus. And we have some other options to choose from right here, but just keeping things simple. I don't want to randomize everything. I want to randomize within a certain range. So I'm going to randomize these note positions by just a little bit. I'll go right here. I will also alter the velocity, randomize it within plus or minus 10 from whatever the velocities are at right now. Let's actually bring that down to 5. And then I'll also randomize the note lengths a little bit, again, by this 10 right here. So now these are selected, so I can choose operate only. I can also select and operate on everything, but I'm just going to operate right here. And now you see that these notes changed a little bit. If I close this down, we have a little bit of differences in position right here, so we aren't perfectly quantized anymore. And we also have slight differences in velocity. So for example, this B2 has a velocity of 106. This C has a velocity of 103. This one right here, this D3 has 104. And so now if we listen back, it's a little more humanized versus having everything exactly the same. Give another example of recording or inputting MIDI information into a virtual instrument and then finessing it within the digital audio workstation. Let's have a look at a drum plugin. Again, this is the Superior Drummer 3, my go-to drum programming plugin. And here we can actually start with programming and drawing stuff in. So I can create another MIDI region here. And I believe C1 is the kick drum. Yep, so we can do something like, and perhaps we can copy and paste that rhythm just over a 4-bar period, and maybe add in a ride cymbal wherever that may be, right there. Just something simple like this, and then maybe give some double kick right there. And you'll notice that I drew this in quickly, copy and pasted it, but all of the notes are perfectly quantized right here, and they are all of the same velocity. So this may sound a little bit robotic if we play it back. And so Superior Drummer is a pretty realistic sounding drum engine with some really great samples, some really great rooms, but you hear especially this double kick at the end sounds super robotic. You can tell that that is just the same exact sound repeated. And so again, what we can do is select everything, go to functions in the case of Logic Pro, MIDI transform, and let's go to the humanize function right here. And again, we can alter the position, the velocity, and the length. So let's do a little bit to the position, not too much. And we really want to adjust the velocity, maybe plus or minus 5 in this case. And then the length, I don't really care too much about the length because these are percussive hits. It's not like by having a longer MIDI note here that the drum sound is going to be stretched out. And so we don't have to do anything with that. So let's select and operate here. And then you saw the colors change just a little bit right here. And if we actually zoom in on this MIDI, we can see that things have been shifted around a little bit. They are no longer exactly on the grid. You can see that especially in these kicks right here, there's a little bit of overlap. What I'm going to do is actually make these notes shorter so that I'm ensuring that they re-trigger every time. And then the slight color differences refer to the differences in velocity. So if I click this one, we have a velocity of 82. If I click this one, we have a velocity of 80. This one's got a velocity of 79. So there is some variation, and just a little bit of humanization can give us something that sounds a lot less robotic. So that last double kick pattern right here sounds a little more natural if we listen back. Versus if I hit undo twice. So it does sound a little bit more varied, a little bit more human. And so we can even go another step right here where we can alter the position and the velocity once more and have a listen to what that sounds like. So I just hit operate only once again, and now you see much more variation in terms of the colors. And if we zoom in, there should be a little more variation in some instances on where the actual position of these are. Again, they aren't straying too far away. We don't want a bunch of mistiming in terms of where these MIDI notes actually are, but we do want a little bit of sway. This is what this sounds like. So it sounds a lot more human than just having the straight same velocity directly on the grid kick drums that we had originally. Now on the flip side of that, we can also opt to record this ourselves. So this track is armed and I have my MIDI keyboard right here. So if I find these notes, yeah. So if I was to record this now, and so that is pretty terrible. And in order to get those double kick drums, I had to use 2 fingers there. And so I can actually go in and draw those last 2 ride cymbals right here. And you see here that I was really maxing things out right here. The velocities are very high. For example, this one's 120. You can hear it being louder in the digital audio workstation. So I may want to actually bring these up to match, maybe down to 120. And if we listen back, this is going to sound pretty terrible. And what we can do now, of course, is maybe bring them down so that they aren't as loud in the headphones. And I can quantize them. So I can quantize them to 16th notes. And in this case, because of these double kicks right here, I should do that. So let's quantize those. And now we have a much better in-time performance. So those are perfectly on time. And because I drummed them in on the keyboard, we already have nice differences in velocity right there. So we don't necessarily have to adjust those velocities, although we could if we wanted to. And additionally, because I have this MIDI in the DAW and it is reliant on the actual tempo of the session, I can now bring this tempo up. Let's double time it once again to 240 and we can have a listen to the drums here now. That's obviously a bit too much. How about 170? And so drums could be a little bit difficult to get the MIDI right, especially if we don't have nice plugins like the Superior Drummer 3, which have natural sounding drums to begin with. They can often sound a bit robotic. And so having these tiny variances in timing and in velocity can go a long way to make our program drums sound a lot more natural within the mix. And so I wanted to give you another example beyond just the keys with something a little more percussive rather than more melodic or harmonic in the mix. If we turn our attention from the drums to this 808 over here with the Sublab from Future Audio Workshop, we can have a look at yet another example of inputting MIDI. So if I wanted to record just a simple bass line here, I could do so by hitting record here. I have this armed now. metronome went off there, so I'm probably a little bit off. So if we open this up, you can see that I'm pretty close, but pretty far at the same time. So you see that I hit 2 notes here. I can get rid of that one. And I can go here again and quantize. I will do this to 16th notes once again. And now if we have a listen here. And beyond that, you can see that I was pretty consistent with the velocities. I'm hitting these pretty hard, but in the case of the bass, particularly 808s where there's a lot of low end, maybe I want things to be a little more consistent. And so I could go back to the MIDI transform here and go to velocity limiter in this case. And now we can limit our velocities at a certain amount. For example, we can go 100 and I can go operate. Now these will all be set at 100 because they were all above 100. And so this sort of limited the maximum velocity to 100. Alternatively, if there were notes well below this 100 value or way above it, I could go up here and actually go fixed velocity. And then this way I can make all of the notes a certain set velocity, operate. And now if I go down here, I have all of these at 111 velocity. And so this way I quickly recorded with my MIDI controller right here. And then I quantized the notes and quickly fixed their velocity and arguably saved some time versus going in and actually drawing things out. Of course, there are plenty of ways to input MIDI. I just want to show you a few different examples here in this video. So the main takeaway here is that if we are drawing in our MIDI information, we can often humanize it to make it sound a little bit more human, a little more imperfect and musical, versus if we are playing things in. First of all, we can play things slow and then speed them up so that they fit into the tempo of the song. But furthermore, we have tools to make things less human, things like our quantization, whether that is in timing or in scale, and then our fine tuning, where we can actually go in and alter the velocity of individual notes and change their timing or their note length or whatever you would like to do within the mix. For example, I can stretch these out and make them sound a little bit cleaner within the mix. So I can drag this one out a little bit, make it a bit longer. And if after quantizing, I don't like the exact quantization of this, I can actually go in here and reduce the strength of this quantization. So if I bring this all the way down, we're going to zoom in and see that not everything is perfectly on grid. And so this might look a little bit different depending on whatever digital audio workstation you're using, but we don't have to quantize everything perfectly. We can have a little bit of sway within the note position just using these simple controls right here. If we go back to these functions, we have more MIDI transform. We can use fixed velocity, so that would be a way to make all of the velocities the same. We can randomize the pitch, for example. If I was to operate here, it keeps all of the notes and the velocities intact, but it changes all of the MIDI notes. We would choose between a range there. Obviously, that's not what we want for this particular demonstration. We can also choose from this drop-down menu, random velocity, so we can operate that. And it really changes and randomizes the velocity from, in this case, 1, so the quietest we can possibly have it, and then 112. In MIDI, we have 128 steps, so I can bring that up to 127 and operate there, so we get the full gamut. And again, that is one tool we have in our toolbox for this piano roll. We also have random pitch, velocity, and length all at once. We can crescendo from the beginning to the end. So in this case, let's go start at 7 and go until 8. And then you see this crescendo happening at the very beginning. We can stretch this out a little bit more if we'd like. So that is all to say that we should get into all of the different options we have in our piano roll, become familiar with them, and utilize them to get the most out of our MIDI. We could double the speed, for example. Or alternatively, half the speed, so we can actually bring it back with another tool right here. And so those are the basics of what we have in Logic Pro in this case. But again, I would encourage you to look into everything you have in your digital audio workstation and take full advantage of those options available to you in your piano roll. Moving on, we have MIDI effects that we can look into. I'm actually going to drop this back down to 120. And if I open up the mixer, we have MIDI effects right here. So in the case of Logic Pro, we have an arpeggiator, chord trigger, modifier, modulator, note repeater, randomizer, scripter, transposer, and velocity processor. And then we can also add in audio units if we really wanted to. But I'm not exactly sure that these would work. So the arpeggiator is pretty simple. Let's open that up on the ePiano. And actually, let's move it to the synth and work on something different right here. We've worked on the ePiano for long enough. Let's drag this over here and open up the arpeggiator. And we can see that we have 16th note rate, 0 variation, 0 octave range, and we are going to be going up. So if I played a basic triad like a D minor, and go to the serum and make sure that this port time is all the way down. We have a basic triad arpeggio there going upward. We can also go downward if we want. We can go up and down. We can go down then up. We can randomize. And then with this same triad, we can also amp up the variation and also the octave range. So let's go to 2 octaves right here. Let's add in that minor 7. And you can see whenever I'm playing a chord right here, we have the velocities going up. So I don't actually have velocities tied into this serum patch. Let's actually do that. So right here, the velocities, I'm actually going to tie this to the level of this synth right here. And I'm going to turn this oscillator off. So now if I play a note very softly, we have low levels. If I play it very loudly, we have higher levels. So let's bring that all the way up. And now we can see if I go back to this arpeggiator that if I am playing one note particularly hard in a chord with a higher velocity, that will stand out more. So in this case, that A that I'm playing is really standing out versus everything else. Now if I add in a C, and I'm just literally holding down a chord right there, and the arpeggiator is doing all the work for me. It's a classic effect and one that we should really take advantage of in our MIDI. If I was to, for example, record that or even just draw it in, I'll open up the piano roll and close this down momentarily. I had a D, we'll zoom in right here. That was a D triad with an octave and then a C up here. And then I was playing these 3 notes a little bit softer. And let's drag these out. I believe this was actually an octave lower. So that was the same as me just holding down what I was just playing, except with an emphasis on that A and the C. So very cool effect right there. And you see that when I was holding it down, I actually saw the notes light up right here. If I add in that D and then the C, you can see those black dots light up in the piano roll. Let's have a look and listen now to the ARP effect on the sampler. So once again, without this effect, we have the snare sample that I inputted. That is the sound of the actual sample itself at middle C. Of course, we can go up, we can go down, and everywhere in between. And with the arpeggiator, now we can actually play a chord and have these samples actually arpeggiate. So if I was to play a cheeky C minor right here and turn this arpeggiator on, and again, it's going to accentuate whatever I put the higher velocity into. If I hit a very strong C, then we're going to get that out of the arpeggiator. We can also use the ARP on the superior drummer, for example. So we could have the kick drum just repeated in 16ths if I only hold down the kick. We could have a kick versus snare, add in a hat, add in a tom, add in something else, so we can get cool little fills right there, and we can sort of randomize them if we'd like. And if we really want to spice things up, we can go variation and then octave range right here. So in the case of the drums, we don't actually have notes that are going to span different octaves. This is actually going to span to a whole bunch of different drum sounds. And so just as a simple example, if I play that C minor, I'll play it across 2 octaves right here. We should get something really interesting with a wide variety of drum sounds. So just something neat to mess around with. I wouldn't necessarily utilize this in my music production, but again, it is something that we can utilize and something that I wanted to show you just to mess around with in this video. So that is just one of the many MIDI effects that we can take advantage of to get more out of our MIDI. We can open up another one, the chord trigger. I like this one. And now we can only play one note. I'll play this D, for example. And now we get a minor 7th chord happening right here just by triggering one note. These are all minor 7th chords. And then we can actually go in and learn different chords to different notes on the keyboard. That's a little bit more advanced, but we can set things up so that we can get, for example, if we were in C major, we could get a major 7 if we hit a C, and then a minor 7 if we hit the D, minor 7 if we hit the E, major 7 if we hit the F, or some sort of Lydian chord if you wanted to program things that way, a dominant 7 with the G, and so on and so forth. When we just load things up, we get the same chord shape for whatever we are playing. All minor 7s in this case. Yet another MIDI effect we can utilize is the modifier, which will just turn the input event so the velocity will assign something to the mod wheel. So in this case, the mod wheel isn't actually doing anything. If we went back to the E piano, for example, and used the modifier here just with the stock input event velocity reassigned to mod wheel, if I was to adjust the mod wheel of this D minor, it adjusts the amount of back and forth tremolo we get. And now if I input the velocity event to this mod wheel, then that means that the harder I press a key down, the more velocity I have in the key, the more we're going to get that same effect that we get in the mod wheel. So that's really high, and then much less so when I'm playing very soft. But we still get that effect right there. Let's move back to the polyphonic synth. Looking here, we have the modulator note repeater. That's another cool one we can utilize. So in this case, we can hit a note and have 3 notes repeat. We can up the repeats if we'd like. We can transpose them. So let's not do that many repeats. Let's just do 2 repeats. So that's going to go transpose down 12 steps every time it repeats. So we could do a tritone, for example. Try that out. And that would be the same as me actually playing the tritone right here. And in this case, every time the repeat happens, it's actually re-triggering the synthesizer. And so we get that envelope right here. You can actually see this re-trigger right here, this blue line that goes down, and also in the velocity. So the velocity is the same every time, but it is re-triggering this envelope. And we can alter the delay right here, so we can slow it down, speed it up, velocity ramp, so we can actually make these repeats go up in level, or down, or even go up in terms of transposition. Let's go up 2 octaves over the 2 repeats. Pretty cool stuff we have there, and that will apply whether we're playing into it or if we have something drawn or recorded into the actual arrangement view itself. If I turn up the repeats here, and actually have the velocities relatively the same. Something else cool that we can do with our MIDI here, randomizer, we have the scripter, which actually draws or writes out script. We have the transposer right here, which we can utilize to keep our notes in key. So for example, if I wanted to do C major here, every time I hit a C, I'll actually get a C. If I hit a C sharp, I'll also get a C. If I hit a D, I will get a D. If I hit a D sharp, I also get that D. E, F, F sharp gives me that F. So I can hit the black keys in the case of C major, and I will still get notes from the C major scale. And we can also transpose up if we'd like to. Always hitting that same note right here. So I'm hitting the A sharp or the B flat, and I'm actually getting an A. That's the A. That's the A sharp. And I'm still getting that same note. So this is a pretty cool tool if you want to transpose within the mix or if you want to change the key. Usually I would always suggest actually inputting the proper MIDI notes, but you can get some interesting effects if you decide to transpose and set a certain key that forces your MIDI notes into that key. Last up, we have the velocity processor, which acts sort of like a compressor except for our velocities. And so we get an input right here, and it will alter the output depending on what the input is. We can get a really sharp ratio so that at lower levels, it's basically linear with the in and out. But then as I hit harder, you see that I'm pressing harder and harder on the input, but the output is actually not ever reaching that 127 maximum right there. It's going to max out around halfway right here. And let's give the sub-lab a little bit more love in this video with the transposer. For example, if I had that C pattern that I was playing a while ago, and I wanted to transpose that up to perhaps an E, I could go up 4 semitones. Or if I wanted to go down to an A, I could go down 3 semitones. In something simple like this, I would probably just change the MIDI, but it is an option that we have. And of course, we can adjust the scale here. Let's go to major, for example. And now if I hit a C and a C sharp, they should both play C. I just have to make sure that the transpose is actually up to 0 semitones so that they aren't actually A's. And if I open up the piano roll right here by creating a MIDI region, you can see that I'm actually playing C and C sharp right here. D, D sharp, they're both Ds. And so that is what a basic transposer MIDI plugin would do. And sorry for jumping around a little bit in this video. I just wanted to give these other virtual instruments a little bit of love versus just focusing on the e-piano and the synths up here. And so those are some cool ways to get more out of your MIDI. In this case, I'm focusing on Logic Pro X because that is my DAW of choice, but I'm sure that your digital audio workstation has a bunch of cool stuff that you can check out. For example, I used to use FL Studio as my main DAW, and there was a lot of cool stuff you could do there in the piano roll, including different glides. You could actually chop up a single note very easily into 16th notes or 8th notes or triplets or whatever you would like. I'm not actually sure there's something we can do for that in Logic Pro. It doesn't seem to be the case. And then Ableton has some cool stuff that you can do in their piano roll as well. I've used Pro Tools pretty regularly working professionally in different studios, and I'm not really the biggest fan of their piano roll, although there are some cool things you can do in that one as well. But those are just a few ways I have for you to take advantage of the different MIDI effects and different MIDI controls that we have within our digital audio workstations. Now, the last tip I have for you when it comes to MIDI is developing an understanding, even if it's basic, of music theory. So for example, we have our basic triads, and I'll switch back to this e-piano, turn off this modifier. But what if I took that minor third there and put it up above to get a different voicing? Kind of a split triad right there. And then what if I added the minor 7, that C, an octave above that? It sounds quite a bit different than it's the same exact chord, but just a different voicing. We can also use inversions. So using that same example of the D minor, that is the first chord right there. The first inversion would be, so it's the same exact notes, the same exact chord. First inversion, and then second inversion would be, so Those are all the same chord, but they do have different sonic characters. And that's just one example of music theory that we can utilize to get more out of our MIDI, whether we're drawing it in or playing it in. The main point I want to get to here is that understanding music theory can help us when we are drawing things in, it can help us when we're planning out and writing music on the MIDI keyboard, and it can also help us to produce music by understanding what MIDI notes, or what notes in general, we should use within a track that will fit within the overall song, and then therefore we can use those MIDI notes with our virtual instruments to get the results that we want. And so those are just a few quick tips I have for you to get better MIDI out of your digital audio workstation. All right, I hope that this video proves useful for you, whether you use Logic Pro or not. MIDI is an extremely powerful interface, and we just scratched the surface in this video, but I wanted to give you a few different techniques to make better use of MIDI in your DAW in case you weren't using them to begin with. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, I do have a free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. You can click on that, sign up to my newsletter, and I'll send it to you right away. And if you'd like to spend more time with me here on YouTube, I would encourage you to check out one of these two videos in the top left or right corner, to subscribe if you'd like more information and you enjoy the way I teach. I'd like to thank you, of course, for spending some time here with me in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.